Help me out. What does it mean to have a completed life?
Well, I think we both feel that at some point we don't want to be a burden to our children. We don't want to live with certain illnesses. I think many of my friends have discussed, let's say, if we got pancreatic cancer, we wouldn't be treated. And that we've had a good life, and if this is our time, we're ready to go. And if there was any way, we'd like to sort of be in charge of when we do go. So I know my husband had looked into phenobarbital. I mean, for years and years, he had looked into all different ways of having the possibility to end his life when he wanted to.
The Completed Life Initiative presents Voices of the Completed Life. In each episode, we share unprecedented conversations at the heart of the human experience. Our hosts dive into honest dialogue about mortality, loss, and grief, as we hear firsthand from individuals who seek to avoid life-limiting maladies in a body that may no longer serve them, and who instead aim to celebrate their lives as completed. These are stories that may challenge and surprise you. These stories are worth listening to. These are Voices of the Completed Life. We want you to be aware that the contents of this podcast include mention of death, dying, and suicide. This podcast is meant for informational purposes only. This podcast content is not intended to substitute for professional advice, diagnosis, or treatment. If you or a loved one are in crisis or emotional distress, please seek out the help of a mental health practitioner or call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 1-800-273-8255. Agents are available 24 hours a day and can communicate in English and Spanish. Listeners outside of the United States of America should call their local emergency line. Our host for this episode, Dr. Lewis Cohen, MD, is an advisor to the Completed Life Initiative who brings expertise in the psychiatric aspects of end-of-life care. Recipient of the Eleanor and Thomas Hackett Memorial Lifetime Achievement Award, as well as numerous honors for his writing, Dr. Cohen is completing his third nonfiction book for the public, Winter's End, about a young man with Alzheimer's who hastened his death. We now return to Lou's interview with Carol, a woman whose husband Doug completed his life unexpectedly.
All right, so we're going to obviously talk more about that in detail, you and I, but if you wouldn't help just sort of introducing yourself a bit so that I can sort of hear who you are, where you emerged from, what your life has been like.
Well, I was born in New York City and lived all around the city, and my mother was divorced. I spent a lot of time with my grandparents. My mother was my primary caregiver, but I did live a lot with my grandparents. And my grandparents were particularly my grandmother was very open about, we're born, we live, we die. And it was just a natural part of my life that death is part of life. And there was just a lot. It wasn't morbid or anything, but it was just a very open discussion. And my grandmother mentioned many times her father had died of a stroke, that if she had a stroke, would we please put a pillow over her head? And then my mother got cancer when she was 72. And it was interesting. She was a big, strong woman and full of life, loved to travel. She'd had 3 husbands. And when her time came, she said, you know what, if this is my time, I've had a good life. Anyway, and then I met my husband when I was in college. He was at law school in Boston, and we married my senior year. We had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. And my children grew up with also hearing that we didn't want to live too long. They saw my father, who was lived to be 99 and had not much of a quality of life. And we sort of commented on it. And so anyway.
You were born, you were raised in New York.
Right.
And can you tell me, what kind of family you came from? I mean, you've given me a sense that your grandparents were important, and that your mom was otherwise the primary. Was this a privileged life that you were leading, or what?
It was, let's say, a solid middle-class life. My grandparents had come over from Prague. They left Prague after Hitler marched in. So my mother married at 19, had me at 23, and then got divorced separated from my father when I was 3.
And the grandparents, immigrants from Prague.
Right.
And what you're also, saying, if I could just underscore it, is that they became immigrants at a moment in time in which there was a lot of death going on in the world.
Yes.
And they were wise enough to get a step ahead of it, but family were caught up in it.
Absolutely, yeah.
And what kind of kid were you?
Well, I think when I was little, they called me Rain and Shine because I was either smiling or crying. So I think of having had a wonderful childhood.
Tell me what the childhood turned into.
Well, then my mother remarried when I was 11. Our whole family went to Europe for a year. My stepfather got a teaching assignment in Germany, and my brother and I were sent to schools. I had finished high school. I was 16 and a half, and I didn't want to go to college. So we went to Europe for the year, and I went to school in Switzerland. My brother went to another school, and we spent the year there. And then we came back, and I went to college here. I went to Wheaton in Massachusetts. Oh. And my 3rd year, I met a friend of mine, introduced me to Doug, who was at law school in Boston. And we married a year later and moved. We lived in Cambridge for 6 months. Then we moved to New York. He got a job there. And then we had Peter a year after we were married. That was the time of the Vietnam War, and we just decided we would have a child. A lot of people were either having children or we had applied to AmeriCare, as Doug didn't want to serve in the Vietnam War. And so we had Peter, and then 6 months later, that was in New York. 6 months later, we moved to Connecticut. And got an apartment, and we're looking for a house. And my grandparents by that point had moved to Stamford. My mother was in Stamford too. So our whole family was close by, which was nice.
Tell me about Doug.
Well, Doug was an incredibly smart person. He was from Minnesota. He had gone to the University of Minnesota. He was one of 5 children. His parents he had a very difficult relationship with his mother. And he decided I can't remember, I think he wanted to go to maybe Yale in economics or Harvard in economics. And then he decided his best choice was Harvard Law School. So he went to Harvard Law School, and that's when we met. His second year and my junior year in college. My mother loved him, and he loved my mother. It was a really nice relationship. He was wonderful to her, and she was wonderful to him. And we didn't see his parents that much. His parents they would come to see us, but they were always critical.
Uh-huh. And the type of law that
He
Doug,
did corporate law.
corporate law.
So
Yeah.
he worked for a law firm in New York. Then he worked for a mutual fund in Greenwich. And then the end of his career was at Pepsi.
We're obviously going to follow the thread of what happened with Doug, but if you could fill in with a little bit more as to what kind of a person he was like. I mean, I hear that there was conflict within the family,
Right.
but what kind of a human being?
He was, I would say he's a very complex person. He had an a great sense of humor. He was incredibly kind when to everybody. I mean, I can tell you so many instances of his acts of kindness, from just when my grandfather was dying in the hospital, just rubbing his feet, to a neighbor who lost a child and they weren't seeing anybody. And Doug knew that every night they would walk up and down Greenwich Avenue. And he said, we've got to go and find them. And so one night he said, let's just go and park a car and we'll walk up and down Greenwich Avenue until we actually bump into them. And on and on and on. He was just the one that always did kind things for people.
That's actually quite a beautiful story.
It is.
Quite a beautiful anecdote. Both of those things relate to people dealing with death, dealing with bereavement.
Right.
Rubbing the feet of your grandfather.
Yes. It was incredibly kind. And when my mother got sick, he would stop every single morning on his way to work and see her.
Did he have a philosophy that he expressed about illness, about dying, we're going to talk about completed life. Are these things that he spoke to you about?
Oh, absolutely. We both spoke about it a lot. We both felt that we didn't want to live incapacitated. He had a much lower threshold than I did. I mean, we sort of jokingly said in our family, our son had his healthcare proxy, and we used to joke that if Doug stubbed his toe, Peter would say, Dad didn't want to live like this. So yes, we talked about it a lot, both of us. I mean, we both felt that, again, we didn't want to be in a situation of needing nursing care, of being a burden to others.
Was he, in fact, a hypochondriac?
No. He had a very low tolerance for pain, but he wasn't a hypochondriac.
And physically, was he a healthy man?
He was. He had, high blood pressure at an early age. He had, he had a few little things here and there, but nothing major.
Okay. Now, some people would say, so the two of you would talk all the time about how much you could tolerate before you wanted to pull the plug. What gives with the two of you?
Well, as I said, I sort of grew up with that kind of thing. I mean, it wasn't all the time, but it was just, we wanted to make it clear to the other person that in certain situations we don't want to live. And we wanted to make it clear to our children too. We enjoyed life. If we were healthy, I, for one, if I'm healthy, I'm happy to live a long life. But there are a lot of things that I can imagine not wanting to put up with. But as I said, my list was a little, like Doug used to say, if I was in a wheelchair, I don't want to live. And I used to say, well, you could still, do a lot of things but he said, no, I wouldn't want to put up with that.
Uh-huh. And your own reaction when he would say something like that? Because I'll tell you, my wife's reaction to that would be, she would say, and you have two children, and just because you're in a wheelchair, you would want to end your life?
Yeah. You know what? I sort of said that, but then he was a stubborn man too. So he would have, it wouldn't have made a difference. He would have, he left, and we'll get into this later, but he left my he was very, very involved in my daughter's 4 children. They lived a mile away. He was with them all the time. And when he took his life, I think what most shocked me was that he would leave those little children. But on the other hand, I said to someone, his hearing wasn't as good. He couldn't keep up when he walked with us. And whereas I think some of us might say, okay, so I walk a little slower and the grandchildren will walk a little slower with you. It bothered him more than other people.
I mean, you've let go with the bombshell that is obviously going to be a focus of things, which is that he took his life.
Right.
Would you tell me about what led up to that? What are the sort of things that were occurring with this man leading up to this?
Nothing that we could really, until afterwards, nothing that I would have thought he would have taken his life then. He, as I said, I know it bothered him tremendously that he couldn't hear. He went and got hearing aids. He was very unhappy with them. He was constantly going back to have them adjusted. They didn't work the way he wanted them to, or what he had. And so there was that. He had also at one point had horrible back pain, and he went for physical therapy, and the physical therapist said, I'm not going to touch you until you go and have your hip looked at, which his brother had told him about years before, because his brother's a radiologist. But as I said, he was a bit stubborn. And so when the physical therapist said this, he went to an orthopedist, and sure enough, he needed a hip replacement. And in some of his final thoughts, he thanked the doctor that did his hip replacement, because he had a whole new life after he got this hip replacement. So that was, in terms of physical condition, in some ways he was in better shape than he'd been in a long time. But there were other things that were bothering him. He still was slower. He, I think even mentally, he was a tiny bit slower than he'd been. In fact, at one point, our children, one of our children, I think, called a family friend who was a physician and said, do you think something's wrong with my dad? And he didn't think so. So they were clearly concerned that mentally he wasn't as sharp as he had been.
And we're talking what age that all this was taking place? The
Probably
hearing issue, the hip replacement. We're talking what period in his life?
Probably he was 73, 74, okay. Somewhere around that.
Still working?
No,
at the time?
He had been eased out of his job at Pepsi, and that was sort of difficult for him at 55. And I think he should have he would have said that he should have looked for another job. Not financially, we didn't need it, but I think for something else for him to do. And we actually had a close friend who was very involved with a lot of philanthropies, and he really wanted Doug to get on some boards. And Doug turned him down and said, not interested. And it sort of led to a cutoff with this friend, because here he saw this very smart man. And he thought, here he is 55 years old and he's not doing more with his life. So that was an issue.
So what, in fact, did Doug do with his life from 55 on?
Well, there were a few rocky years for him. We wound up, let me see. That was when we had sold our house that we'd been in for 29 years, and we were building a new house. So that occupied him for a while, for about a year and a half. He tried playing some golf. He wasn't a great golfer, but he enjoyed the guys. He had a great time with them. He started a bridge group. That was fun for a while, but then a lot of those men wound up getting into duplicate bridge, which he didn't want to do. So that group dissolved. He had an investment group for a while. That group sort of petered out. But probably right around the time that those things started petering out, our daughter got married and moved to Old Greenwich, a mile from us, and started having one baby after the other. And he adored babies. So he said in his notes that the last years of his life were the happiest ones he'd ever had. He did. I mean, he was, everybody around Old Greenwich knew him. He was always at a construction site with a little child toddling after him.
Oh, it sounds kind of beautiful.
Oh, it was, yeah.
So you say you were surprised by what ensued.
I was by the timing. I thought Doug, I knew I knew he would take his life at some point, or I felt strongly. I mean, I was pretty sure, but I was totally shocked by the timing. I thought he would wait a few more years. I didn't think he was in as bad shape as he was in. So yes, I was very surprised, and so were my children.
Before we continue with Carol's powerful story of her husband, Doug, we reiterate that the contents of this podcast are meant for informational purposes only. The content is not intended to substitute for professional advice, diagnosis, or treatment. If you or a loved one are in crisis or in emotional distress, please seek out the help of a mental health practitioner or call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 1-800-273-8255. Agents are available 24 hours a day and can communicate in English and Spanish. Listeners outside of the United States of America should call their local emergency line.
Yeah. What happened? How old was Doug at the time, and what occurred?
Well, he killed himself on December 30th of 2019. His birthday is March 28th, so he was 3 months short of 77. And it was interesting. Our sons had invited us to go down, and my daughter, they'd invited my daughter too. All of us, they wanted to go to the Dominican Republic for a holiday over Christmas. And my daughter couldn't go with her family. And my husband hated traveling. Doug hated getting on planes, particularly the way travel had gotten in the last years. But then in about, I guess they had started discussing it maybe August, September. And in October, he said, all of a sudden, I think we should go. And I was surprised, but I thought, he's just softened and decided it would be nice to do this. I don't know, looking back, if that was because of he had this plan in mind. I'm not sure. I think it probably was. So anyway, we went to the Dominican Republic, to this all-inclusive resort. And he even wrote to my son afterwards. He said, he had checked on TripAdvisor, and there were all these horrible, horrible reviews of this place, what an awful place it was. And afterwards, he wrote to my son, we got home on a Saturday night, and he took his life on Monday. He said, it was much better than I thought. And he also was very interesting. Doug was the kind of person that always, like if we went to see the children, we would take turns driving. We often drove. And he would always write these incredible notes afterwards saying how wonderful the visit was, even if it wasn't. I mean, sometimes the visits weren't so terrific. But he would write these incredible notes to the daughters-in-law and to our sons and the grandchildren, saying how wonderful the visit had been. So anyway, he wrote a note the day we were all leaving the Dominican Republic, saying how normally we don't, we just give these, little hugs and everything. but you never know when the last time you're going to see someone. And maybe we should just give a little bigger hug. And we didn't think anything of it because this was so typical of Doug. And afterwards, I said to one of my daughter-in-laws, I said, did you think anything of it at the time? And she said, no, because Doug did things like that all the time. But then looking back, I'm thinking, that was sort of, maybe he was telling us something then. Anyway, so we got home, late, it was almost Sunday morning because the flights were delayed and everything. And he even wrote joking comments because he normally would have been sort of miserable about all these delays and the travel, and the flights were packed, but he wrote, sort of funny things saying, how the travel was, and the guy next to him who was just crazy and ranting and raving. And that was sort of, he did that sometimes. He could either have a tirade about how awful it was, or he could be funny about it. And he was funny about it. Anyway, and then sort of the morning that he, like on December 30th, he sent out this email he had tons of people that he would always send emails to, or, articles that he thought were interesting or something. And he sent something, and I can't remember the name of it, but it was some beautiful poem about life. And he sent it to tons, all these people, sort of a New Year's message. And afterwards, everybody thought, But again, Doug did that kind of thing anyway, so we don't know, was it his last message? And he talked to his brother the morning he took his life, and his brother was just shocked afterwards. And he said, I'm just stunned. So yeah, that was, and then Monday night, I had been out, I was going out and playing bridge, and I came home and he wasn't home, which often he didn't tell me, he just would be out and come home, dinner time. And then the next thing I know, the doorbell rang, and it was the police saying they found his car at Greenwich Point. And it was a horrible night, horrible. And I called some friends to come over and be with me, because we were still trying to find out what had happened. And I didn't want to tell my children until I knew what was going on. And then they found, I guess they were trying to find out if he had his phone on him. And he did. Well, I had to call my son, one of my sons, because they had the same, he was on their plan. And we could tell where he was, anyway, and they found him.
What had happened?
He had had a gun, and he went and shot himself. We knew he had a gun. He had a little gun safe, and I think he didn't want to kill himself that way, but he saw no other way. He talked about in his notes how he had tried to get phenobarbital. He tried to get drugs from other countries. He even made a joke of how he lost some money in Mexico. And he just wanted to make sure that when he decided to die, that it would be done.
So he left behind, you said, a note.
He left, yes, lots of notes over the course of years, discussing how at some point he would take his life. Little bits and pieces of over the years. But then there was a note that he wrote the last probably a few weeks before he died, just thanking us all for a wonderful life and what a wonderful life he had. And then he wrote a special note to my daughter's family, because he felt that he hadn't said goodbye to them, whereas he'd said goodbye to the kids in the Dominican Republic. Yeah.
And as much of an explanation, what did he convey?
Just that it was the time for him to go, and that he didn't want to be a burden to anyone. He didn't know what the future would bring. He also, a little background too, he had a baby sister who was, Judy was maybe 8, 9 years younger than Doug. And she died of ALS about 4 years maybe before Doug. And it was a horrible, horrible, horrible death. It was when she was diagnosed, she went into deep depression. She was an incredibly independent person who just, the loss of independence was just so cruel to her. And he talked to her a lot, and he actually was with her the day she died. She and her husband lived in Nashville, and her children lived in Portland, Oregon. And she went through the whole dying with dignity in Oregon, and she had the pills. And she was going out. She had gotten so bad that she was going to go to Oregon and take the pills. It was right around Thanksgiving. And Doug went down to say goodbye to her. He drove down. It was a last minute thing, like
down to Nashville.
Down to Nashville, because she was going to be going to flying to Oregon in the next few weeks. And he got down there, and she was just deteriorating incredibly fast. And they wound up, actually friends of hers said they won't let her on the flight because she was just slipping away so quickly. And so my brother-in-law, who had worked for Hospital Corporation of America, he called his boss, and his boss, who was incredibly kind, said, "I'm going to send my plane for you. I'm in Texas, but I'm going to send my plane for you. And you keep it as long as you want, and I'll fly back commercially." I mean, people are so kind. And so Doug was there, and there was an incredible nurse who Doug just adored. And she said, she's transitioning, she's going. And they took her to the airport. Doug went with them in his car, and he said goodbye to her in the car because she was about to get on the plane. And he decided to leave to get a start home. And she died in the car before she ever got on the plane.
And he came home to you saying what about this experience that he'd had with his sister?
Well, he was in awe of this nurse. In fact, he wound up, my brother-in-law was very frugal, even though he has been very successful. And Doug sent this nurse a big check, I don't know how much, but a big check for her. And he said she was so wonderful. So we almost came away with this wonderful feeling about how terrific she was. She was so kind, and all of Judy's friends had come the night before to say goodbye to her. I think he sort of thought the ending was peaceful, even though the disease had been awful.
And even though she had not made it to Oregon to die quite the way that she intended to.
Right.
In those couple of years following, or maybe before, had Doug been involved with any of the Right to Die organizations?
No, he definitely, he read some of the books, I think, and he followed Kevorkian, but he never got, I think he sort of was doing his own thing.
And he was not somebody who had actually made attempts, as far as you know?
Oh, no. Uh-uh.
Did not come from a family where people had ended their lives by suicide?
No.
His psychiatric history, if you don't mind my just...
Yeah, no.
Had he been in treatment with a psychiatrist?
No, he never suffered from depression.
Yeah. But you did mention that there was some question whether some of his faculties might be beginning to wane, whether there were some early signs of dementia beginning to occur.
Yeah, but as I said, once it was almost like it was a temporary, I don't know, so hard to explain. There was that time, and as I said, my children called our good friend who we used to walk with every Sunday at the beach, and because they thought our friend would be a good person to assess Doug's capacity, and said no, he didn't see any, but I sort of saw little bits, but I can't say it was anything huge, but he wasn't as quick as he had been.
And again, just, where I'm floundering a bit is, and maybe you are floundering too, is what it was about that period in Doug's life, that moment in Doug's life, when he decided that it was time to go, that it was time to end things with a gun. What was it that prompted him to think, my life, should be over at this moment?
I sort of said to some people that I think he always had a scale, and it was weighing, where is the scale? Where am I on this? And I don't know there was something that tipped that scale a bit. And that's when he made the decision. And I'm not sure what it was.
Puzzling.
Yeah, it was, because when I say I can't tell you how many people's reaction was, not that they weren't thinking that the other kids would miss him too, and our children, but these little kids who we saw every day.
The four grandchildren.
The four grandchildren who live nearby. But it's interesting, people say, well, how are the kids? And the other thing he always said to the kids, he would talk to the kids and he'd say, if anything happens to me, I've had a good life. And then I had to laugh because one year I had a birthday and one of my little granddaughters came up to me and said, they call me Cece, and they said, Cece, if you die now, it's okay. You've had a good life. And I said, you're absolutely right. I have had a good life, Hillary, but I would like a few more years. But so I think they think of him that he's had a good life. It's interesting. And as much as they missed parts of him, and certainly, I don't know, I guess also in their eyes, he probably was very old, was old. And we talk about him all the time. On his birthday, he loved Dairy Queen blizzards. So all the grandchildren on his birthday, we all go to Dairy Queen's and have a blizzard and remember him. Anyway.
That's a pretty wonderful image. Really a nice ritual in your family.
Yeah.
The obituary. How straightforward were you or whoever wrote the obituary about the method of his death?
That's interesting because my daughter wanted to put there was first an article that an old man was missing, and looking back, if I were to do it again, would I have said that he took his life? I think I would. But at the time, I knew everybody would know, and we weren't hiding anything, but we just died suddenly. And my daughter did want us to put it in, and I just at the time couldn't do it.
But you think, now?
I would, yeah, I think I would.
And why would you now? What's different now?
I think because people knew anyway. I would put it, I would try to soften the way I said it, but I think it's important just to be upfront. And we were upfront with people when we saw them, so why wouldn't we have been in this obituary? Mm-hmm. As I said, at the time, we wanted to get an obituary out quickly. A friend of mine wrote it. And in fact, it was interesting because, so this happened on a Monday night. My 3 children, all flew in the next day. That was a Tuesday. And my daughter had been in Florida with her children. and her husband didn't know what to say to these four little children. So my daughter got on FaceTime with her children and told them what happened. And my oldest son told his kids. My second son is a little more squeamish, and I don't know what he would have done, but he sort of had to follow suit since all the other kids knew. So then the kids, the daughters-in-law and my son-in-law came back on Wednesday with all the kids, and we had a service at the house on Thursday. And the little kids all would have started school on Thursday, but since the cousins were around, my daughter let them skip school. So they were going back to school on Friday. And the school psychologist wrote my daughter and said, when the kids come back into school, we want them to come right into the office, because we want to tell them that they cannot tell what happened. And my daughter said, absolutely not. She said, you are not telling my children that they can't say what happened. Everybody in the community knows. And I'm not, this is not happening. And so they backed off. And, I think my kindergartner, went up to one of his friends and said, my grandfather shot himself. And the other little boy said, oh yeah, my dad shot himself with a BB gun. And that's the end of it. Kids are just, they're incredible.
But it's an interesting segue that you're making, which is, how to talk to the public in an obituary, how to talk to one's children, how children talk to other children.
Right.
And these are all kind of things that are evolving and changing, aren't they?
They sure are. And one of the touching stories is that my neighbor across the street, who heard Doug talk to the kids all the time, he knew them from the time they were born, and she initially didn't tell her kids what happened. And so Amy, my daughter, she said, if you want to send the kids over to our house to play, send them over. And Amy knew that she hadn't told her children what had happened. And so Amy said to her, she said, my kids might say something, so I just want you to know if they come over, they know how my father died. And this woman said, don't worry about it. That's my problem. I'll deal with it. And which I thought was incredibly kind.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
And we all have to sort of deal with it. But what I think is going on is sort of a detoxification that's taking place, sort of ridding suicide from being just a taboo subject to one that it happens, so why shouldn't we talk about it?
But one of the things, it was interesting too, some people sort of just either got it or just sort of, but there were some people I just thought, I don't have the energy to explain why Doug decided to do this, and they just are uncomfortable with the idea of taking one's life. And I just thought I didn't have the energy, and I still don't, to sort of try to, well, I wouldn't try to convince them, but explain, I guess.
Let me shift the focus a little bit to you. You had said there were always differences when this subject would come up, and it was a regular topic that came up between you and Doug, end of life matters, the notion of a completed life. It was something that you wanted your children to hear from you. Tell me what your own thinking is now about a completed life.
Well, I too, I don't want to, once, it was interesting when my mother was very sick and dying, she turned to the doctor at one point and said, I don't want to live anymore. And the doctor said, well, what do you want to be able to do? What's the minimum you want to be able to do if you want to stay alive, And she said, and I was sort of taken aback at first, she said, well, if I can't go out to dinner with friends and play bridge, I don't want to live. At first I thought, what about my children? What about this? And I thought afterwards, but her daily life was being with friends and doing something. And if she was just sitting there, she didn't want to live. And I got it. And my grandfather, when he was very sick, said to the doctor, I don't want to be here anymore. And he said, you've got to kill me. And the doctor said, I'm sorry, I can't. So thinking about my mother, I'm thinking, even though I adore my grandchildren and I spend a lot of time with them, if I can't have dinner with friends and play bridge at a minimum, I don't want to just be sitting in a chair with a nursemaid taking care of me. As long as I'm independent and okay, that's fine. But, and then I think, boy, that's a double whammy for my children if I do something. But on the other hand, if, I don't want to be a burden.
I'm always interested in the concept of preparation. And I'm curious, it sounds like you have prepared your family by having conversations really their entire life, your entire life. Any other preparations that you have been doing, anticipating that, there might come a time where you were ill enough that you could not play bridge and associate with your friends?
Yeah, you know what? And I'm not great at sort of preparing, and so that's something I probably should be doing more. I have when I changed internists, I did in my sort of interviewing or having a new doctor, did talk to her about not believing in prolonging life. Mm-hmm. And she told me to make sure my children knew of my thinking. And I probably need to do more. I mean, that's something. I tend to be a bit of a procrastinator. And so even though I strongly believe this, I should be doing more.
Well, I think we could probably broaden this and say we all should probably be doing more. I would think that the Completed Life Initiative will have its hands filled in trying to help people become more knowledgeable about what options are there and what steps can we take. I'm thinking, again, on a personal level, I started with a new physician just this year. Mine had retired. And one of my questions to my new physician was, how do you feel about accelerating one's death? Because that's something that's important to me and something I've been thinking about and writing about, and I'm involved with this movement. And I learned somewhat to my horror that my new physician is very clear that she is opposed to that, or at most she's neutral. But come the time, I can't necessarily count on her being an ally.
Yeah.
Now, did I dismiss her as a physician and go look for somebody else? No, I haven't done that. But, it's just one of those things I'm thinking about.
Yeah. But, I would never put my children, my daughter's a pediatrician. I don't want any trail, and I wouldn't even ask them. And my husband didn't either. He, I think, maybe talked to my son. I'd have to ask him more about things, bounce things off him, but he wanted no trail to lead to our children and any involvement that they would have.
Yeah, I mean, concerns about their liability,
right,
criminal implications.
Yes.
I mean, it is not against the law to take your own life, to commit suicide. But there are laws and restrictions in most every state about assisting someone.
Right. I mean, I have gone so far as to say to my children that if I had a stroke, you've got to put me on a plane and take me to Switzerland to Dignitas. How practical and whether that could actually happen, I don't know, but I have mentioned it to them.
Yeah, well, we got some sorting out to do, don't we?
We sure do. We sure do.
You just heard the incredible story of Carol and her husband, Doug. We want to thank Carol for her courage to tell Doug's story. We at the Completed Life Initiative welcome his and Carol's story and hope that it illustrates the complexities facing those who wish to have full access to self-determination at the end of life. If you would like to share a response to Carol and Doug's story, please feel free to reach out to us on our social media platforms @CompletedLife. Additionally, if you are interested in sharing your story of a completed life on this podcast, whether for yourself or a loved one, please reach out to us via email at info@completedlife.org. The goal of this podcast is to share end-of-life stories of all stripes, to further weave together our collective understanding of what it means to live a completed life. This has been Voices of the Completed Life. Thank you so much for listening. Visit us at www.completedlife.org. That's completedlife.org, where you'll find extensive video content regarding resources on aid in dying, featuring discussions led by expert clinicians, bioethicists, policymakers, and end-of-life doulas. At the Completed Life Initiative, we advocate for a person's right to direct their own end-of-life care. Take control over your transition, your life, your choice.